Reagan stumbled just as badly in the Iran-Contra affair, refusing to acknowledge his error with the same stubbornness that made him go through with his controversial visit to a German military cemetery containing the graves of men who had served in Hitler's SS. In both instances, a pragmatic leader elevated intransigence to the level of principle. That both men emerged from these controversies largely unscathed is a tribute to their formidable gifts of persuasion, first honed through self-persuasion. Reagan actually believed he had seen Holocaust victims in Nazi concentration camps, when he had in fact glimpsed them on film only. For his part, FDR solemnly assured voters in 1936 that, quote, "I have seen war," or as he said, "I have seen war. I have seen blood running from the wounded. I have seen men coughing out their gassed lungs. I have seen the dead in the mud." He neglected to mention that he saw most of these things from the windows of a Rolls-Royce that carried him on a 1918 inspection tour of World War I battlefields, where an outbreak of influenza posed more danger from germs than from Germans. In the words of his distinguished biographer, Jeffrey Ward, Roosevelt could never leave history alone. In the White House, he was forever inventing conversations with imaginary garage mechanics and Chinese laundrymen who just, in the president's words, just dropped by long enough to voice agreement with his policies. None of these visitors were ever recorded by White House staff, but they showed up repeatedly at presidential press conferences. Spectral evidence of Roosevelt's supposed closeness to ordinary Americans. But this was so much overkill. Few, if any, American leaders have ever inspired greater devotion, or, it must be said, more vitriolic hostility. The same could be said of Ronald Reagan. Of course, the similarities between the two men, however striking, are outweighed by FDR's love of experimentation and his genuine disdain for the old order. His New Deal was an improvised response to the gravest economic crisis in the nation's history. The Reagan Revolution, by contrast, was rooted in ideological convictions developed over more than 30 years. In the end, each man pursued fundamentally different objectives. By promising economic security through government action, FDR established political norms that would last half a century. Yet the life jacket of one generation can become the straitjacket of the next. By a curious twist of logic, Reagan refused to concede that his election in 1980 heralded a repudiation of FDR's policies. Indeed, he did not hesitate to summon Roosevelt's ghost to justify what he called the new beginning. Reagan told an audience early in his first term, quote, "With the same energy that Franklin Roosevelt sought government solutions to problems, we will seek private solutions." In making this claim, Reagan tipped his hat to a leader whose enduring impact placed limitations on just how transforming his own presidency could be. George Will said it best when he declared early in the 1980s that the American people were indeed conservative. They wished to conserve the New Deal. As a result, the man who spoke of an America without limits was forced to disguise his U-turn as a mere change of course. Historians, like generals, are prone to refight past battles. Many find it difficult to categorize the Reagan presidency, to apply conventional rules to this most unconventional of leaders. Just consider, a conventional leader would have hesitated to confront the basic assumption which has governed American politics since 1933, the belief that Washington must inevitably exert more control over personal and economic decisions. Reagan not only challenged such ideas, he left in his wake a new consensus that would both govern and limit successors of both political parties. Bill Clinton did not set out to be the most conservative Democratic president since Grover Cleveland. He was forced into that role, contrary to his activist instincts, because he inherited the anti-Washington consensus bequeathed him by Ronald Reagan. A conventional leader would have taken for granted the existing superpower relationship, balanced on the equilibrium of Cold War hostility. Reagan insisted that the Soviet Union was a historical aberration and that the Cold War could be won by the West in our lifetime. A conventional leader would have been satisfied with incremental progress on arms control, slowing the rate of increase in the world's nuclear stockpiles. Reagan believed that the arms race could be ended and the stockpiles eliminated. When it came to foreign policy and his reputation as a staunch anti-communist, Reagan managed to have his cake and eat it too. He liked to tell of the mythical American and his Soviet counterpart who were comparing their respective forms of government. In my country, said the American, I can walk into the Oval Office in the White House, slam my fist on the desk, and say, I don't like the way Ronald Reagan is running the United States. Well, replied his Soviet counterpart, I can do the same thing in the Politburo. You can? Asked the incredulous American. Certainly I can. I can go into Gorbachev's office, slam my fist on his desk, and say, I don't like the way President Reagan is running the United States. There was another Reagan, I have to tell you one more Reagan story, because he loved to tell this. You know, he told Gorbachev stories around Gorbachev, which suggests the kind of relationship that they had developed. So one day, Gorbachev decided to sort of turn the tables. Gorbachev decided to tell a Gorbachev story to Reagan. And this concerned a long, interminable, very Soviet line outside a store with a little bit of meat and a few other consumer goods. And the line went seemingly for miles, and it barely moved. And ultimately, people just got fed up. And they were on the verge of rioting. And someone stepped out from the line and said, I can't take it anymore. I'm going to go shoot Gorbachev. And he went off, and everyone cheered. And he went off to in the direction of the Kremlin. 24 hours go by. The line's moved about half a block. He comes back. Someone says, well, did you shoot Gorbachev? He said, no, that line was twice as long. Great leaders not only have a sense of humor, they can turn it on themselves. A sense of humor, I've always said, is a synonym for a sense of perspective. If you can laugh at yourself, then I think that's a wonderful safety valve, and great presidents all have that capacity. Franklin Roosevelt loved to tell the story of the Wall Street executive who would buy a newspaper every morning, look at the front page, swear, and throw the unread paper in the trash can. One day, the newspaper stand operator asked the executive what he was doing day after day. I'm looking for an obituary, said the businessman. But sir, obituaries aren't on the front page. They're toward the back. Son, said the executive, you damn well better believe the obituary I'm looking for will be on the front page. FDR was a conservative radical who forged a new consensus in place of the prevailing orthodoxy of the 1920s, one that accepted the growth of the state and the overriding importance of the presidency. Moreover, Roosevelt insisted on an economic Bill of Rights to complement the political rights enshrined in the original amendments to the Constitution. He sought not freedom from government, but freedom through government. Ronald Reagan, by contrast, was a radical conservative who exalted the sovereignty of market forces, going so far as to compare government to a baby, quote, an alimentary canal with a big appetite at one end and no sense of responsibility at the other. Ironically, his victory in the Cold War and the return of power to grassroots Americans would produce a post-Reagan presidency that was more visible and less powerful than at any time in 60 years, until 9/11. It's a terrible thing, said Franklin Roosevelt, to look over your shoulder when you are trying to lead and find no one there. In the economically desperate 1930s, it was said that it took a man on crutches to teach a crippled nation how to walk. But it was one thing for the president who proclaimed himself Dr. New Deal to raise a nation's spirits, not to mention billions of dollars of government spending, quite another to convince a people who harbored bleak memories of the First World War that they should again enter the lists against European dictators. For most of the 1930s, Roosevelt waged a war of words because public opinion could stomach nothing stronger. For himself, the president never doubted the threat posed by fascist dictators in Berlin, Rome, and Tokyo. With mounting frustration, he watched as Japan occupied Manchuria, Mussolini took Ethiopia, and Hitler annexed Austria before the spineless democracies handed him Czechoslovakia on a platter.